Omar, can we do a sound check?
Assalamu alaikum, Taimur. Are we on?
Yes, we are not live yet.
Okay. Give me the cue when you're ready.
So you can start in 10 seconds.
Recording in progress.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. مرحبا بكم في لقائنا.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome in our 54th meeting in the series of lectures that is conducted by CIGA. Our topic today will be about the situation in Syria, the field situation and the future prospects about what is happening in Syria. And the presenter of this lecture today, who is with us, is Mr. Ahmed Al-Saleh. He is doing his master's degree here in Sabah ad-Din Zaim, and he is the CEO of the Northeast Center for Syrian Study. He's going to speak for 40 minutes about the current field situation in Syria, and then we are going to open the floor for discussion. Of course, our audience can tune in with us on YouTube, and I would like to thank the interpreter, Omar Qahwaji, for volunteering to interpret this meeting into English. Thank you very much. Thank you indeed. Thank you, Dr. Sami. And I would like to thank CIGA for giving me this opportunity. Of course, talking about the prospects of the future is one of the new sciences that came late in the Arab and Islamic world. The seminar that I am presenting today is part of a huge study that we have conducted in Northeast with a large number of researchers in order to try to figure out all the aspects of the Syrian condition and try to apply algorithms and different techniques, including 42 or 43 techniques and algorithms on the situation, short and midterm period from 1 to 3 years. And this is an ongoing process. It's not a one-time thing. We include or we input the conditions on the ground, and it is a proportional issues based on the person who is doing the anticipation and the variables that they are included. So no matter how objective the center tries to be, there will be a subjective factor that will change according to the party or the body that is conducting this study. I will start by showing the field political and military map, the current military and political map in Syria.
Taimur, can you give us share, please?
Taimur, we need to be able to share screen here. Please give us the share screen function on this laptop. The events in Syria since 2011 in order to reach the evaluation of the current situation in Syria, and then we're going to speak briefly about the techniques of the anticipation of a future, how they are used, and then we will move on to the conclusions and the summary.
تمام. أولا
First of all,
بدأت الأحداث
Syria late after it entered Egypt, Libya, Yemen, and then there were protests in Morocco, and then it came to Syria. But in Syria, it was the fiercest. The Syrian regime has taken the tactics of sectarian alignment, and it used mass massacres, including the use of barrel bombs and chemical weapons. So it was following a zero-sum games in its solutions, and it has taken the tactics of negotiations only to buy time. It also worked on the demographic change, and it worked on the infiltrating the opposition and the weakness of the opposition. Since early on, the regime tried to militarize the revolution. The opposition didn't have a unified narrative or a unification, and due to the poor political experience, it became a tool in the hands of the foreign powers, and by the passage of time, it didn't have any leverage to express what the opposition actually needs. Step by step, we started to see statelets or mini states, to see cross national organizations that made use of the weakness of the central government, as for example the PKK, whether it is ISIS or the PKK. ISIS disappeared, but we started to see now Syria that is divided into 4 areas of control. The regional powers, since the beginning, took sides either with the regime or with the opposition. Very little countries that changed their position. For example, Iran, since the beginning, it aligned strategically with the regime. The higher spiritual leader of Iran in 2011 declared the support of the regime, and in the beginning of 2013, Iran officially said that they are sending combatants directly to support the Syrian regime, and then it's called Shia, Afghani, Pakistani, and Iraqi militias in order to position them in Syria and support the regime. Whereas Russia sufficed in the beginning with the political support of the regime, and then in 2015 it took a critical decision to intervene militarily to the side of the regime. Nominally, it is to the side of the regime, but the Russia wants to have the lion's share in the political arena and to take to maximize its political gains. From Syria. On the other hand, we have Turkey, Qatar, Saudi, and Egypt. The regional countries that surround Syria, they were to the side of the Syrian revolution for certain considerations. Turkey, for example, cannot be a bystander on a war that has with it around 700 kilometers of border lines, and so it needed to take a position to compensate for the strategic partnership that took with Bashar al-Assad. Saudi Arabia didn't want to lose Syria towards Iran. Egypt under Morsi, of course, this changed after Morsi was toppled. The irony was that some of the Palestinian factions took the side of the regime, for example, like the Popular Movement, and Israel, after 2011, tried to be on the neutral, and some of other Palestinian factions were also neutral, and then step by step they tried to incline with the regime more and more. We can talk about the Syrian events or the chronology of the Syrian event as the following. First, the peaceful protests, and after the failure of the Arab and international initiatives and the killing of the crisis management cell in Syria, and a lot of researchers think that this crisis management cell was the wing that wanted to reconcile with the opposition and to bring about a political change similar to the change that happened in Egypt. So the killing of the crisis cell was the step that gave space for the hawks, so to speak, of the regime, or those who are prompted for the security solution to take control over the decision of the Syrian regime and to move forward with the security solution. So Syria got into the violence and counter-violence. There were massacres, the sectarian massacres, and there were a lot of casualties. Then on both sides of the conflict, we started to see the ideology, inclination, and the sectarian narrative, like Iran and Hezbollah on one side, and the jihadi elements before ISIS came to existence at a later. Violence reached very serious levels. The critical point for the high voice of the high tone of the idealization was the establishment of the caliphate and the interference of Hezbollah and taking control of Al-Aqsa. There are two other factors that were added to that. First of all, the fall of Egypt under control of the counter-revolution and the increase of polarization in the Arab field between the Arab Spring revolutions and the counter-revolution forces. The next phase in the development of the Syrian landscape was the direct interference of the countries like Russia and the global coalition. Russia came to the side of the regime, and the coalition were to the side of the opposition. But of course, Russia intervened not because they didn't want the regime to fall, not for the protection of the regime itself, but because they wanted to do a crisis management and to maintain the to refine the landscape. After the fall of ISIS, or the defeat of ISIS, the borders took shape, and we came to what we call in our center the stalemate of Sochi and Astana. We start to see three key players: Russia, Iran, and Turkey. They got into a phase of negotiations in order to keep the status quo, long-term negotiations in order to maintain the gains and to gain some kind of troubled balance, so to speak. These are the visions that are adopted by the center, but is not necessarily something that everybody agrees on. Now, if we look at the map of the military control in Syria since 2011, in the beginning we had peaceful protests, but the regime, of course, was in control of all the territories of the Syrian Arab Republic. We started to see small spots that were going out of control of the regime. The opposition had only one color that includes all the factions of the opposition, but it was fragmented, some of them in Deir ez-Zor, some in Homs, some in Idlib, some in Dera. It was a kind of the peaceful protests, or like the mosquito those bites, as it is called in the guerrilla warfare. And after that, we started to see control of the opposition over main cities like Raqqa, Aleppo, and Homs, and then the opposition took control over 83% of the Syrian territories. After 2013, ISIS started to appear, and the violence took a spike. ISIS controlled most of the lands that were under the control of the opposition. So ISIS, or the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, benefited from by controlling areas that were under the opposition, not those under the regime. This continued. The opposition was losing territories to ISIS, and the regime was losing some of the territories to ISIS until the interference of the global coalition and the battle for Kobani. We started to see the Syrian Democratic Forces. The SDF, or Syrian Democratic Forces, they were affiliated with the PKK, and they took a new shape of organization. It was called the Syrian Democratic Forces. It was supported officially by the global coalition in order to defeat ISIS and restore the territories that were controlled by ISIS. Of course, as you see here, the map is moving quickly, but of course it has a lot of details of blood, wars, fierce battles. We have more than 6 colors on the map and more than 20 countries that have military forces and the troops on the Syrian territories. ISIS, of course, was beaten from 2 sides, from the global coalition and the east of Euphrates, and from the regime supported by the Russian Air Force from the west of the Euphrates. So the Euphrates was considered the buffer zone between 2 operation rooms, one of them under the United States and the global coalition to the east of Euphrates, which is rich with the oil and underground wells, and another one that was under Iranian militias, the Syrian regime, and Russia and Hezbollah in the west of Euphrates. In 2019, or around 2019, the control became stable, and some of the enclaves of opposition in the south were sent towards the north. This situation continued for over or around 4 years. If we want to summarize the control in a graph for the for facilitating analysis, in this graph we have 3 colors. The first one, which is in color, the strength of the opposition. The red color is the level of the Syrian regime, and this black color is for the improvement of or the development of ISIS. As you see in the beginning, in 2011, in the beginning of the graph, the regime was at the top of its strength, 100%, and the opposition was in its beginnings, and ISIS was in its beginnings as well. When the regime started to crush on the protests, the regime was suffering, and the opposition also started to decline until the armed resistance started with the opposition, and the opposition started to have more strength. Then we had the intervention of Hezbollah in Al-Qusayr and Aleppo, so there was another decline in the force of the opposition. Then we started to see the jihadi factions, which brought back some strength for the opposition. In 2013, as you see, the opposition started to decline. So the ISIS was on the rise and the opposition was on decline. That's why the year 2013 was a critical year. Since 2013, the curve of the regime became static. The ISIS was rising, and the opposition curve was declining. This came at its culmination in the fall of Aleppo and the Turkish intervention, the direct intervention of Turkey in 2015, around the end of 2015. Here, with the Turkish intervention, there was at the fall of Aleppo, which is toward in the beginning of 2016, and we see that the line became linear, the line of the opposition, and the regime also had a linear development, and ISIS also fallen down, and it is linear. Now we can learn from this graph two things: the benefit of foreign powers of the conflict in Syria, and making it stable at a certain access for international interests or foreign interests, not for interests in Syria. The mistake that made the opposition since the beginning, because they didn't offer a unified political project, and the opposition depended on fragile projects that were infiltrated easily, so they paid a very high price according to that. Now, this is the map of control that we have today. It is a very complicated map. Syrians know most of its details, but we can summarize it as the following. The yellow color includes the SDF forces, which are supported by the Global Coalition. The Global Coalition has an operation room in the east of Euphrates, and the tools or the pawns on for implementation on the ground are SDF, and of course this cannot be a buffer zone between two countries, as the situation show in different experiences in the world. So the Euphrates became or witnessed a lot of incidents of smuggling and killing and operations, and it became a source of death rather than a source of development. The Syrian regime suggested the notion of the useful Syria that has high population, that has agricultural resources and wealth. Of course, this was presented that although the regime doesn't control all of Syria, but it has control over the useful Syria. The Americans had different opinion, so they installed 3 military bases, one in a 10th in the green to the southeast, and one in a Shaddadi, also in green, and one in Al Umar oil or gas field. I'm going to explain why these areas. The areas in green in the north of Syria, they are under the control of the operation room that is led by Turkey. When the Turks entered the Peace Spring operation area, SDF, with the support of the regime forces and the Russians, created a wall. It is in red on the M5, which will prevent the Turks from moving forward, and there are still military points on that line that are headed by the Russians and the regime and the SDF. In the south, in Daraa, at the lower south of the map, there is a kind of a stalemate in Daraa and Suwaida. They are not 100% under the control of the regime, and they don't have an autonomous administration. And this might lead to a situation that might be implemented in the future, to have a safe zone in the south and a safe zone in the north, similar to that was in Iraq. If we want to identify the actors, the main actors in Syria, inside Syria, we have four main actors. We have the opposition, the Syrian regime, SDF, and ISIS. The regional powers are five: Turkey, the Arab countries that normalize their relations with the regime. Most importantly, Algeria, Jordan, United Arab Emirates, and then we have Qatar, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. The international forces that are involved in the Syrian issue, we have the United States and Russia. I will start to explain the parameters of each of the players that we have seen. First, Russia. Of course, Syria is not on the top of the priorities of the Russian national security, but Russia intervened in Syria in order to gain or to get some gains that can use to negotiate the West and the United States to get a peace that overlook the warm waters. Russia is now busy with the Ukrainian crisis, so it might waver some gains in the Syrian issue in order to get other gains in the Ukrainian issue. We have the United States and the global coalition. As I mentioned, we have three main military bases inside Syria, two in SDF areas and one in the Syrian desert, Al-Badiya. Al-Tanf is in the center of the Syrian desert in order to maintain the current map and prevent Iran or any other force to make any advancement. We have the Al-Umar base, which is the largest gas or the largest oil field in Syria, and no one is allowed to control that area. So the United States wanted to control oil in order to prevent stability in Syria. And Al-Umar base also overlooks the Euphrates River. So it is one of the monitoring points for the buffer zone between the two operation areas, the Russian one and the American one. And we have another base in Ash-Shaddadi. It is a strategic military base. It is almost at the Syrian-Iraqi borders, and with the aim to control the Al Jazeera area and Al Hasaka governorate. In the American strategy, the American strategy towards Syria, it includes 3 points. First, taking control over the strategic points, so like oil, for example, and the final solution is under control of the United States, not under any other countries. The second one, to prevent any political or military forced to make any advancement. For example, when the Russians wanted to move to the east of Euphrates and to take control over one of the oil fields, they were bombarded by the Americans, and there was a large number of victims of casualties, and the Russians didn't declare the numbers of those who were killed in this operation. I believe the main purpose of the U.S. presence in Syria has to do with the main question: what does the United States want from the Middle East? Because if we know what does the United States want from the Middle East, we can know what does it want from Syria, because its behavior in Syria is similar to its behavior in Iraq and Afghanistan, with all the differences in the geography and with the players. So the United States know what does it want, but we need to ourselves to find an answer for that question. Does it want the creative chaos or what? In terms of Iran, Iran sets a strategic policy in order to become a regional and international superpower. Therefore, its strategic sphere, whether towards the Mediterranean or in other direction, it tries to be present there strongly. Syria is important for Iran because it is the road towards the Mediterranean, and in order to control strategic military points, in order to put the pressure on its adversary, whether the United States or Israel, and there have been hundreds of events of bombarding places of presence of the Iranian militias. Iran also makes sure to be present within certain communities like Deir ez-Zor, Damascus, and Dara, and Iran tries to consolidate its presence at levels higher than the political solution, which means that it tries to have demographic and religious and economic presence, and linking students in these three areas in specific, linking them with scholarships to Iran in order to have long-term presence that goes beyond any political solution that might take place against the will of Iran at some point. If we look at the road between Tehran and the Mediterranean and the military points that Iran is present at, confirms this narrative. The presence of Iran is linked mainly with the road towards the Mediterranean and Israel. In terms of Turkey, Turkey wants to limit or to contain PKK or eliminate it altogether, and it doesn't want to have any impact of the Syrian crisis to the internal conditions in Turkey, whether in terms of the economy or any other aspects. As for the Syrian regime wants to take control over the political and military situation in Syria altogether, and it tries to transfer the achievement that it made, which is confronting the Syrian opposition or Syrian revolution, to become economic recovery and to get out of this international isolation, relying on some international and regional powers, and to try to lift some of the pressure that is put on its grassroots or its constituency because of the war. As for the Syrian opposition is looking for renewal of the political plan and to recover from the defeats that it has taken in the past year, and it also tries to consolidate its international and regional alliances in order to for that purpose. It tries to get closer to the Kurdish National Council, and it tried to stay away from the Qatari-Saudi dispute and other examples. ISIS is trying to reorganize itself and to present a new political project away from the caliphate that lost its legitimacy according to the power presence. As for SDF, it is trying to survive in the face of the threats of Turkey, ISIS, and other threats. And in order to do that, the international legitimacy is very important for SDF, because the global coalition and the US troops are dealing with them as a military actor, not a political actor, because they did not get any political recognition, and Turkey is preventing any recognition of that kind. After the Arab countries, after the Gulf reconciliation, they are trying to get back to Syria, but there are a lot of obstacles in that phase about the role of Iran in the future of Syria and how they are going to do so. The Arab countries are still having a lot of confusion about Syria. In terms of the techniques of anticipating the future, we tried to make the anticipation of future is an ongoing process, a living document, and we relied on different techniques, because each technique looks at the future prospects in a way that is different from the other technique. Of course, this anticipation that I'm going to present to you is 6 months old, but when the Ukrainian crisis erupted, it could have led to variables different from what has been presented in our anticipation. So we revisited this after the Ukrainian crisis, and we found that this anticipation is not very likely, because Syria is not on the top of the list of priorities of the international forces. I'm not going to explain the ways that we have done that, because it is technical issues that are not in the scope of our attention in this lecture. We have put the anticipation for each area. We divided, or we broken that down on based by two issues. First, the political, economic, and military sectors, and the other one is through the player. So if we want to look at the impact of the economic situation, the impact of the current economic condition on the future, or the impact of the future on the economic conditions, we have found that in terms of the international and local economic situation, all parties are losing. The only party that doesn't have any loss was ISIS, because it doesn't have economy. So I believe that this is because of the recession and the inflation, the global inflation, and because of the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, the rise of oil prices benefited some parties, but the same parties lost a lot before the rise of the oil prices. تمام.
فمثلا عندما جمعنا الارقام الحقيقيه شفنا
So
انه
when we collected the figures, we found that all parties are losing from the current crisis, except ISIS. ISIS is the only one that is not losing, because it doesn't have expenses, it doesn't have an economy, so it is ready to feed on any loots of war, and it doesn't have any expenses. In general, after reading the Syrian condition, we found that the points of leverage in Syria are 3 points, which are the members of the Astana talks: Iran, Turkey, and Russia. Other parties are either unable to put pressure, or they're not willing to put the pressure. For example, if we look at the graph of the actors in Syria, for example, the United States and the global coalition, they are capable of putting pressure and to make gains, but they don't want to. They want to maintain the chaos without gains. It goes back to the vision of the United States and what they want from the Middle East. As for the Arab countries, most of the leverage points were lost by the Arab countries because of the way they dealt with the condition. And this applies to Qatar and Saudi Arabia. The Syrian regime is very weak, and it is suffering from a very bad economic condition and the fatigue of its constituency, so it's unable to do anything. The same applies to the opposition. It doesn't have the initiative, and it doesn't have the project. ISIS as well, it doesn't have, it lost the ideology that incited people or to mobilize people in the beginning. As for SDF, they have taken way more lands than they dreamt, so they want to get out just to survive from this condition. What remains is Turkey, Russia, and Iran. For those countries, in the coming 2 to 3 years, Iran will be busy with the nuclear deal and reaching agreements with the American government. It is unable to set a local strategy in order to know what strategy to approach towards the regional or international forces. So it is waiting to see whether a deal will be signed or not. Russia, it seems that it is busy with the Ukrainian war, which is not clear how long it's going to take. So in the coming 2 or 3 years, Syria will be at the bottom of the priorities of Russia, and it will be using Syria for gains in Ukraine. It doesn't have a lot of things to lose in Syria. Turkey, which is busy with the internal economic problem and the elections that will take place after 1 year from now. So Turkey is busy as well. Turkey tried to make use of the American and Russian disparity in the Syrian issue, but it failed to do so because the unstable balance that is or the troubled balance that is present in the Syrian issue is useful to some powers. So if Turkey was able to get some agreements with the Russians, the Americans will protest to that, and if the Americans agree, the Russians and to something, the Russians and the Iranians are against that. So the situation requires more than one actor to break this stalemate. So this is the conclusion that we reached, that between from 1 to 3 years there will be a troubled or unstable balance that international forces or anxious stability, so to speak, that that the international powers will not allow it to develop into a war or to a complete stability. All parties are monitoring other players or other actors, and any party that will try to reach any gains on that file, others will be prepared and monitoring that movement. International and regional players are going into a way of competition amongst allies. So they are not in full alignment and they are not in full competition. So they are trying to get the best of this situation. The main reason of this anxious stability is that each party or each player has strategic problems that they cannot solve on the midterm. So all parties are relying on time in order to overcome those strategic disadvantages or weaknesses. For example, the Turks are not satisfied with their entry into the Syrian territories, and they are trying to improve that. Iranians are trying to change or to time. The Russians until now believe that what they have paid in Syria is way more than they have gained from this condition. So they are also relying on time in order to get a better price or a better benefit from Syria. So in conclusion, all actors, including the United States, they need time for their own purposes, but they all agree on this anxious stability that will continue, as we have concluded, from 1 to 3 years. Thank you very much. That's all from my side. Thank you indeed, Mr. Ahmad Saleh. He managed to combine two contradicting ideas between the summarizing and going into detail. So he summarized the historic situation and he detailed on the condition right now. If I would like to give some comments, and then I will open the space for those who want to participate. I have 4 points I would like to comment on. The first one, I didn't see a lot in the analysis the Israeli factor. It might be a very important factor, not only in the beginning, but also in through the crises, the different crises. He mentioned the continuous strikes against their enemies inside Syria, but it is an active player, even if it's not very evident, but it is there, especially to explain the Iranian intervention, the huge intervention in this crisis and their allies. If the Iranian intervention has to do with the Israeli factor, then this will be a very important factor to understand and analyze. The second point, as we are talking about the Iranian condition and its position towards Syria, there are different interpretations. One of these interpretations speaks about a project, an Iranian project to control the entire area, and there is another interpretation that it is a project of resistance of the Western and Israeli hegemony. So if this is the interpretation, then it explains a lot of what's happened, and we need to take the Israeli factor into our consideration, because if Iran loses what it has gained in Syria for decades, in Syria and in Lebanon, so this setback will continue for years to come. So through this analysis can be understood that it will maintain its strategic gains and their resistance against the other, whether it is the Israelis or the Americans. So this is something that needs to be taken into consideration in the analysis in order to understand that the reasons thereof and the future of the conflict. The second point has to do with the Russian intervention. Part of the Russian intervention has to do with its international visions of the international. The United States has around 600 military bases around the world. Russia has only 1 or 2 bases, one in Pakistan and the other one is in Syria, in Tartus. And this military base is a marine base, and it has to do with the vision of Putin and the Russian strategists that Russia is threatened at the geopolitical level. So having a marine base is very important, in addition to the fact that Syria is the only ally for Russia outside its sphere. And even with the Ukrainian war, Syria is present for Russia, and it's important for Russia. Maybe they can negotiate Syria for Ukraine maybe that will be important before that. But now this is not valid anymore, because they need to have a fleet outside Russia in order to face the international forces. The United States has two main objectives First, in terms of Iran, first of all, was to exhaust Iran and its and the allies of Syria in the Syrian war, and this is something that I have witnessed firsthand. In 2014, I was going out of the house arrest, and I entered into a hotel celebrating the Tunisian constitution, and I was using a pseudonym, a name of a journalist. And I asked someone, he was responsible for Syrian and Libyan files in the US Department, and I asked him, what is the strategy for Syria? And he very frankly said to me, it is the exhaustion of Iran and Hezbollah, and they don't want Assad to fall. But if there is a danger or a threat, that Assad will fall, so they're going to strengthen the other party, but without winning over al-Assad. So at all, this strategy for the United States, they found that it's very important, and they see the direct relation between the proportionate or the relative force between the axis of resistance and Israel is very important. Another point, which is the policy of the United States in the north of Syria or in the Kurdish areas, especially in the oil-rich areas, it has to do directly with confronting what they see a Turkish project, at least to strengthen Turkey in the region, or the project of Turkey, which is seeking to get out of the US control. This policy started at the days of the United States, at the days of Obama, and all the policies in the United States changed to support the Kurdish forces, not necessarily because they believe on the grievances of the Kurds, but rather to confront Turkey. Because the policy of the United States is that it doesn't allow any regional power to be in control of its sphere, and if they get out of control, they try to find an alternative in order to create a balance of power. So those forces who want to get to be in control, they will be busy with these new conflicts, and we don't see from the neighbors of Turkey anyone who can compete with Turkey, whether Romania or Bulgaria or Armenia or Iraq. So the most important policy that the United States has taken since the days of Obama was supporting the Kurds in the north. And they have provided more between 30 to 50,000 forces, not to face ISIS, but to face a state. And so this is the policy of the United States. Therefore, Trump retreated from this policy for reasons that has nothing to do with the U.S. national security. And this led the Minister of Defense, the U.S. Minister of Defense, to resign, and which means that this is part and parcel of the American strategy. So the American policy was trying to find this Kurdish enclave because it is the only one that threatens Turkey, and it will bring Turkey back to maintain its internal unity, because it has 20% of its population from the Kurds. So this is one factor that needs to be taken into consideration. So again, we need to understand what does Iran want, and what does the United States want from the Middle East, and what does Turkey want. All of these actors need to be understood. Now, we will take some questions, and then you can answer all of these questions together. Who would like to?
لحظة في الميكروفون عشان والميكروفون علشان يخرج للآخر. نعم.
تمام، شكرا جزيلا أستاذ أحمد على العرض الجميل والمفيد. شكرا دكتور سامي. سؤالي الحقيقة ليس له علاقة
Thank you very
مباشرة.
much. Thank you, Dr. Sami. My question may be not directly related to the presentation, but in the name of the center that Mr. Ahmed is leading, which is Northeast. Why you have a center that is under the name of the northeast of Syria and not all of Syria?
دائما هنالك لعنة الجغرافيا تصيب بعض المناطق.
Well, the curse of geography sometimes affects people. The northeast of Syria was marginalized for reasons that are not under the control of, for natural reasons, because of its distance from the center and the economic centers in Syria.
رغم انه حاليا
Although
شرق سوريا
right now, the north of the real fight in Syria is taking place in the north of Syria because of the underground wealths, and because it overlooks three countries or four countries like Iran, Turkey, Iraq, and of course Syria. And most of the researchers working in this center are from the northeast of Syria, and because it is a new center, so our of course our ambition is very large and to become number one in information, and we wanted to have a certain specialty, and we found the best way to have our specialization is to specialize in the northeast of Syria, because we know the area better than any others, and because we are from there, we have the ability to understand that area without amplifying problems or undermining these problems. So we have selected this specialty, and I believe that we succeeded in that because it is the only center that is specialized in this area, whether in terms of the issues or the geographic sphere. So I believe that this was a specialization in order to take our space in
سبقتنا في مراكز بسنوات ربما مئات
to compete with other centers that are older than us in this field. But of course, what we believe is that Syria is, or the northeast of Syria is part of the northwest or other areas, and we don't agree on any ethnic in any ethnic division or any division on any other grounds, regardless of the ethics of the revolution. We trying to look into the geopolitical factors and political factors, regardless whether they are moral or not, in order to understand and to select and to conduct our studies, or to study these phenomena, regardless whether they are moral or not. And we wanted to have our position in among other research centers.
شكرا جزيلا أستاذ أحمد على هذا العرض.
Thank you, Mr. Ahmed, for this presentation.
بالنسبة للتعليق اللي ذكره الأستاذ
The comment that Dr. Sami mentioned, I have a question in terms of the justification of the Iranian intervention. I wonder about what answers this question about which is the time where the Iranians intervened. I mean, which came first, with the beginning of the Sunni protests, whether the Israeli intervention or the Iranian intervention came first in Syria?
في الحقيقة يعني كان عندي بعض الملاحظات حول
I had some comments
أسباب الدوافع المحفزة لهذه الدول
on the reasons that incentivize those countries to for intervening in Syria. I didn't see a diagnosis for the countries in the beginning to engage in the Syrian conflict. For example, in Turkey, you talked about the PKK and their concerns about the PKK or the separatist Kurds and the refugee crisis. These concerns came later, other than the PKK, for example. But I didn't, for example, see in the bigger picture what does Turkey want from this area, and you didn't also put this competition in its international sphere. Maybe there were some secondary aspects that you have diagnosed for each country, but there is the interaction between these countries and what creates the international or the world order, and the competition amongst the different countries. In Syria, the conflict erupted in at the same time with other conflicts, for example, in Georgia and then Yemen and other places. So it is the same geopolitical belt with different between the same competitors. And also, when Dr. Sami talked about the policy of the exhaustion policy, for example, one of the researchers talk about the policy of let them bleed with each other. When you talked about the entry of ISIS to the area, the entire area was colored, or the entire map was colored in green, and suddenly, when half of the map was under the opposition, suddenly ISIS came to presence, and all of the green areas became black, and then ISIS task ended, and if so to speak, and then the yellow color came into place and the regime remains safe. So do you think that the expansion of ISIS has nothing to do with the ideology, or that it is an intelligence work that like the United States, for example, in order to maintain the Syrian regime and not to fight it or to topple it? So do you think so? There is another point. When you talked about the regional powers and their vision about the Syrian regime, and I am Algerian, and you said that Algeria is a country that stood to the side of the Iranians, the Russians, and the Syrian regime. We can't hear the speaker if he doesn't use a microphone. Because I always hear this, that the Algerian regime supported the Syrian regime, and they use a number of evidence. And when you talked about Iran and Russia, you mentioned Algeria. Regardless of that, I just want to know your vision about or how do you see the Algerian position toward this crisis, and do you put them all in the same basket? So, for example, what Algeria have done is similar to what Iran has conducted or Russia done. I want to understand your vision or your understanding of the Algerian position, at least to have a dialogue later on this point. I have a lot of points, and I would like to finish on this note. Now countries are talking about the Chinese rise and those countries that and the Vision states and that are rising now. Do you believe that the United States have become now when we see the crisis of Taiwan and the southern China Sea? Do you believe that the United States is going to support those forces that are rising against the Chinese regime, or if we are going to analyze the condition, do you think that the United States is going to exhaust those forces, or do you believe that Syria is not one of the priorities for the United States and it is more interested in China and other countries? Are there other comments before we take the answers from the speaker? Okay, I will answer the part that is related to me, and then I'm going to give Mr. Ahmed to answer the questions directed to him. The question was about the justification of the Iranian intervention and whether the Iranian intervention came first or the Israeli came first. Any country, actually, that is a bordering countries or a country of confrontation with the Zionists or the Jews, there is an ongoing intervention, and we need to take into consideration that part of the Syrian territories are under the Israeli occupation, and even if there is a kind of a Cold War, but there is the Israeli factor is always there, even if it's not very clear. This is the first point. The second point is related to whether we believe or we don't believe, and this is something that people might be different on whether Iran has a project to confront Israel or it is using this issue for other purposes. But this is something that people have different opinions on. But I will start from a hypothesis in an attempt to explain this issue. And if you reject the hypothesis, the explanation will be rejected. If we believe that there is an Iranian project, at least part of the regime in Iran that started in the beginning of the revolution with the slogans, and then it developed into an action, and there is confrontation between Iran and Israel, and at least Israel recognized that. And when Netanyahu was asked who are the enemies of Israel, he said we have three enemies: Iran, Iran, Iran. So it is the only enemy that Israel sees as it is enemy. So part of this project was to invest in a project, part of that is related to the regime, and part of it related to its strategy. And there was part of the strength in Lebanon that we had billions of dollars that were spent to build that force. Now, if you are a statesman and you find that there is a revolution that has its own justifications and all the causes and genuine reasons in order to face or to confront tyranny, you need to take a decision here. You either support your project or you support this project, because now they are contradicting. You cannot be to the side of the regime unless you are against that party. So now you have to take one decision, which is the higher the higher value that you have. The sectarian interpretation doesn't solve this issue. That we need to find that in a political condition. Now you look at who are supporting the opposition. Are they your enemies or your friends? And we found that the United States, for their own purposes, for example, or the Saudi Arabia and the Gulf state, Israel is playing on both sides. And in Washington, I listened. This is something that I heard myself. One of those who were speaking on behalf of the opposition, he said that it's not necessary that he represents all the opposition, but he was speaking with the influential powers in Washington, telling them, if you remove Assad, we will give you the Golan Heights. So this is, if you are investing in a project for 40 years, regardless of the grievance of the Syrian people, I'm not discussing that, and it's not about the suffering of the Syrian people. It's similar to the suffering of the Palestinian people, and the grievance of the Palestinian people is not because of the nature of its people, but because of the center of the Palestinian cause. So they have made their calculations, and they found that this is it has a higher value for them. And this, from the same opposition, they didn't have a strategy, and relying on the opposition was not successful. And I believe that I remember the first prime minister, Syrian prime minister of Syria, he failed to do that. And Bandar, because he was in control of the file, of the Syrian file, he didn't accept him. So how are you going to conduct your resistance, regardless of the grievance? Once again, how you are going to conduct your project if you are getting into this gamble? Now, if you are getting into that war, there are no middle solutions. You are either in or all out. So this is the problem of the Syrian issues. So this is, if you don't accept this explanation or this hypothesis, then the entire explanation will not be accepted. The other factor, that is the international factor, was present. And the matter remained that what is the hypothesis under which we can understand the events? If you accept this hypothesis, then we can understand that. If you don't accept it, then you need to find another hypothesis. The question was whether the Russian intervention has to do with the Israeli factor, because it contained Iran. The Israeli position was very consistent. Netanyahu visited Russia in that period more than any other prime minister. Every 1 or 2 months, he used to go and say, we're going to do this and that, and receive acceptance. There was a Russian green light, and it is related to other issues, not really relevant to the Iranian-Israeli conflict.
بس ما قبلته امريكا. هذا الموقف لم تقبله امريكا.
If they pass the microphone, we will be able to interpret.
لازم تتكلم خلال الميكروفون، لأن الناس ما تسمع. أنا فاهم فكرتك، عشان كده أنا حاول أدخل، ولكن إذا حبيت أن تشرحها فعبر الميكروفون.
تمام، أعيدها. فقط أنا كان سؤالي.
Okay, my question was, do you believe that the Russian intervention or presence, or the Iranian and Russian presence, contained the Israeli intervention in this crisis, or made it limited? What made me say this there are some signs
لما شاركت هذه الدول الغربية
when those Western countries, the Western democracies, so to speak, participated in
لم يشاركوا ورفضوا أن يكونوا جزءا
putting sanctions on Russia.
لماذا هذا الموقف الإسرائيلي تم تبنيه هو
The Israelis rejected to do that. Why? Because, and some analysts say that because of the Russian presence in Syria. Because the Israelis were afraid of any Russian reaction or for the sanctions. So the Israelis were afraid of imposing any sanctions to get any negative interaction or reaction from the Iranians or the Russians in Syria. So they remained neutral and they didn't intervene more than their intervention in Syria. So it was a kind of a deal between them. If you don't intervene here, I'm not going to impose sanctions or hit you with my militias. So it was a kind of balance of powers and the limitation of the Israelis in intervention in Syria. Your question is of two parts. The first one is about the intervention, the Israeli intervention in Syria, and what you call the containment or the limitation of the Israeli intervention in Syria. I believe that the goals of Israel didn't change, whether before or after the Russian intervention. What is in order to understand or to talk that the Israeli factor was contained, we need to understand what is the Israeli role or the Israeli intervention. For them is limiting other or containing other forces, whether the Iranians or Hezbollah or other allies was more important because they know that the regime is weak. But there was a kind that any attempt to strengthen those powers, the Israelis will hit those points. The Russian intervention made that complicated. So there was it is very important to make Russian-Israeli coordination in order not to have any mistakes and in order not to have any Russian casualties. So there was a kind of coordination that we are going to hit this place or that place, and this goal didn't change a lot. But I don't believe that there was a huge limitation because the goals didn't change. Now, why the Russians agreed on that? Because the Russians don't have a problem in containing their allies if they have the higher hand in Syria. So stronger presence of Iran in Syria might compete with the Russian presence. So they don't want Iran to have a higher hand. That's why even between allies, there is a kind of competition. Whether they are, for example, two allies in NATO, they are allies against others, but they are competing with each other, etc., etc. So this is the short answer. And we are going to listen to the last comment from Mr. Ahmed. Thank you for your questions. First, the political science or the science of politics came to explain the behavior of politicians. It might succeed or fail in explaining that. I believe one of the issues that in the science of politics, in the explanation of the behavior of politicians, is the intervention in crises. I believe that countries participate in crises because they have to do that, regardless whether they're going to win or lose. So, for example, a businessman has to remain a player in the market, even if he's the market share will mean that they are going to pay and they are not going to make a profit, because if they are out of the market, it will be very difficult for them to get back. So some powers believe that if they don't participate in Syria, it will make the future solution will be completely away from their interest. This is my own belief, and I started with the lecture that this is a relative point, and I summarized 300 or 600 pages of the research in 30 slides, because sometimes we believe that that 90% of the condition is as such, and we consider that the 9% is not likely. Talking about ISIS, I believe that it is an anonymous corporation, and I believe that the pockets or the enclaves of ISIS, different countries have different enclaves. So if any solution comes to existence that this country doesn't accept, they are going to mobilize their ISIS pockets here or there in order to foil that solution. In terms of Algeria, of course, with all due respect to you and Algeria, we are talking about a political position and not a moral position. Right now, for example, those who are leading the campaign to bring back Syria to the Arab League is Algeria. Maybe the justification is to get Syria out of the alliance with Iran. So this is one of the points that or the entry points of the counter revolution, because they envisaged that bringing Syria back will enforce or strengthen the Arab alliance against the Persian alliance. After after the war or after 2011 or after 2001, Iraq became out of the forces. So before the Arab Spring, three forces were controlling the Arab decision, and they were Egypt, Syria, under Hafiz al-Assad, and in the beginning of Bashar al-Assad, and Saudi Arabia. After the Arab Spring, this formula changed, and Egypt became voiceless. And I believe the three countries in control became Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. If these three countries agree together, there will be a decision issued. If not, so there will be no agreement in the Arab League. So other countries, whether Jordan, Algeria, or other countries, when they do something, they will be moved or driven by one of these countries. The current that supports the regime considers that the war is over and we need to get into a new phase that is fairer. The United Arab Emirates is leading the reintroduction of the regime right now, or at least until now. Saudi Arabia and Qatar don't want that.
لا مو بأقفص مدفوع، هذه معادلة رياضية قد ما تصلح دائما. لكن أقول إنه هذا التيار اللي تقود الإمارات حاليا يرى إنه في عودة النظام بحكم
the movement that is led by the United Arab Emirates, they think that bringing Syria back to the Arab League will lead to taking Syria from the alliance with Iran, and that this black decade or this bloody decade in Syria is over and we need to move to another phase. Until now, Qatar and Saudi Arabia are against that. Qatar very strongly, but Saudi Arabia in less strength, and the United States is against that. So when the Jordanian king, for example, took some steps to bring back the regime to the Arab League, the veto came from the United States, not from the Arab countries.
إنه هذا موقف سياسي وليس موقف أخلاقي.
This is a political position, not a moral position.
مبرر أخلاقي إنه خطوة أولى باتجاه جره للطريق الصحيح، خطوة أولى باتجاه.
So the justification might be that this will be a first step to get into reconciliation. So this is a political step, it's a political position, and not a moral position. So we don't build on that, that this is a correct or a wrong decision, but we can analyze this decision. So this is in short. We still have 8 minutes or 7 minutes.
السياق يعني لاحظت هنا اولا تناقض ثم عندي نقطه اخرى.
I have seen a contradiction, and then I have another point. You said that the main countries are the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, and all other countries or the initiatives by other countries are driven by or linked strategically by one of these to one of these countries. So the initiative of Algeria today to bring Syria back, and not the Syrian regime, to the Arab League means that it is a secondary initiative if it's not supported by the United Arab Emirates. Is that what you want to say? If the United Arab Emirates is the one with this will, so Algeria now is doing a functional effort in favor of the United Arab Emirates. For what? To get Syria away from the Iranian sphere back to the Arab League sphere. In this issue by itself, it is contradicting because, as you know, Algeria and Iran have very strong relations, and Algeria doesn't have problem if Syria and Iran have strong relations, or if Syria has strong relations with Turkey or United Arab Emirates or any other country. What I want to say is that the will of Algeria to bring Syria back to the Arab League has nothing to do with what the UAE wants or Qatar or any other country. That's what I want to highlight, because it's not things that are related to what you are saying now, but I hear it a lot from Syrians who are here when they talk about Algeria. And this is another point, and I always hear that the reasons of the support of people speak about the regimes, not about the logic of state. They speak about the willingness of political regimes. They say that the Algerian regime, so to speak, that they call it the military or the despotic regime, is to get is a kind of consistency with the similar regimes, so which means, you know, like minds regimes, because the Syrian regime is a military one. And this explanation has no meaning for me. The people also say that Algeria supports Syria because Algeria has strong relations with Russia, and it is the first strategic partner with Russia, and the Iranians are part of this axis. So the Algerian positions are explained in this context. The other point also that also here that has nothing to do with the logic of the Algerian state, which is when you put when we talk about the states of the Arab Spring and the countries of revolution and the counter revolutions, and this is not a correct explanation. and there is nothing that makes Algeria part of the counter revolutions. Now, if this is the, how can you explain the Algerian position towards Haftar? Because if it was part of the counter revolution, it should have supported Haftar, right? But it has a lot of conflict with the United Arab Emirates on that file. So how can you explain that? So there is a kind of stereotyping in the thinking, and that are wrong and that are driven by certain parties in order to disinform people about some countries. We can talk about that for a long time. Thank you very much. I will make a comment and then we will conclude with the final comment from Ahmed. States have static or stable positions and or constants and dynamic positions. One of the constants with the Algerian is the towards Palestine and the sovereignty, for example. So they don't allow intervention in other countries, and that countries have their own policy and their own sovereignty, and the same applies to the Palestinians. So that's why Algeria, for example, cannot normalize or work with countries like the United Arab Emirates, regardless of the position of the peoples or analytics or politicians. Syria is still one of the regimes that is confronting Israel, and that Israel is an enemy. So it wants to have allies in the Arab League in this field. So Algeria, when it asks for having Syria in the Arab League because it wants to have allies in the Arab League, to that, and it, for example, similar to what it has done in the African Union, it led the movement not to have Israel as an observer party. So when there are two principles or two priorities, this is the principle that it takes a priority over the other priorities. So there might be a tactical alliance between Algeria and the United Arab Emirates, but it doesn't take the same level of reasons or justification that the United Arab Emirates wants. So the disengagement with Iran, between Syria and Iran, doesn't apply here, but it is it can be understood from the constants that Algeria has towards Palestine and other issues. My final comment, I will not take a lot of time. As I said, it is a political position, not a moral position, and the relativity of the ally and the enemy. You might have a state that is a competitor or an enemy, but it is helping in other issues, like Israel and Iran, for example. They are adversaries, but we have, for example, heard about the Iran-Contra. So they might cooperate on one point, although they are adversaries. So the relativity between the enmity and the friendship, this is something that is known in politics. But what I want to say, also not to underestimate any country, Algeria right now, just like Egypt and other countries that are suffering from the period of the post-Arab Spring, the absence of a project. So the United Arab Emirates has a project. Qatar has a project. Saudi Arabia has a project. Egypt doesn't have a project. Algeria doesn't have a project. Jordan doesn't have a project. So when it leads an initiative without an entire project, it can be an independent initiative. For example, the initiative of Algeria can be interpreted in different interpretations, or maybe not related to what happened previously. What I want to say now, the notion of the revolutions and counter-revolutions after 10 years of the Arab Spring, it has taken different meanings. For example, Saudi Arabia was against the revolution in Bahrain and supported the revolution in Syria, and they supported the counter-revolution in Egypt. And we can use the terminology that we want. It's not very problematic, but the countries that, when I said the counter revolution, they are. I just meant that it was one of the countries that were against the revolution in Syria, and even the term of the Arab Spring can be argued. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. This is the first time that we speak about the Syrian issue in detail in our center. Thank you very much. And we will continue the discussions of these issues. Next Wednesday at 7 o'clock, we will have a discussion about Kashmir and about what is happening and the Indian policy, especially in terms of revoking the rights that Kashmir enjoyed since the independence of India until what happened 4 years ago, or its independence from India. Thank you very much and see you then. Peace be upon you all.